we started High Times magazine, I was down in Florida, and we talked them into sending us a big bundle of magazines for free. And so me and this guy named Padre, who was in my affinity group, the Godzilla Brigade.
That was part of the Yippies.
Yeah, we were definitely Yippies. But during the riots down in the Republican National Convention, we were doing mobile civil disobedience, pretty much just like we're doing here, except we don't have the lock boxes and the radios and all the coordination. We're just trying to sit down in the street and stop things, and then that wasn't working. So we started, hauling dumpsters in the street, and that wasn't working. So we started hauling cars in the street, and then we stopped some buses with delegates on it and made the delegates get out and walk through a crowd of people throwing eggs and stuff at it. It really wasn't, it was a pretty wild riot. And anyway, so that's where I'd met Phil, or Padre as we called him. And, we had got them to send us a bunch of High Times copies, and I think we probably were the first distributors in Florida. And we just used them to sell, so we had money for food and drugs, and eventually him and I hitchhiked out to Texas and got on a shrimp boat. I think I worked on that boat about 3 months.
What's Prasad's plan, to have this 20-foot joint?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was his idea. He was the one most concerned about getting it finished. I don't think things are that much different today. We have a lot of people here in Washington for this World Bank demo that we never met before, and we've got them doing all kinds of stuff, whether it's in the kitchen or whatever.
So what was it like hauling that big joint down the street?
It was kind of fun. I was a little afraid because, it was a felony in Florida at the time, but we felt we had enough people to where, we could at least avoid getting busted in the street. And of course, they didn't know there was actually real pot in the joint. And then by the time we got to Flamingo Park, there were a few thousand people there, maybe more. There's a big civil rights encampment, Resurrection City 2, and, there were a bunch of gay groups that were, pissed off at the Democratic Party for backing off on gay rights. And so there was enough different people there, and most everybody, plus the Vietnam veterans too, had a camp. But, most everybody was smoking pot, so that wasn't really a big issue. And by the time we had the smoking, we had, pretty much everybody in the park getting high. It was 7 pounds or something of, Mexican cheap reefer. And, we smoked a lot while we were rolling it. We had about 30 people up all night in the Mary Street house rolling joints. We were up to like 2 in the morning. So I don't think we smoked more than a pound ourselves. No, he was rolling joints too. Everybody was rolling joints. I never got to be real friends with him. He realized that I was, an enthusiastic young volunteer. I turned 18, I think the day the Democratic Convention started. So they were very open. They were a little paranoid about cops and stuff, but they seemed to, if you looked like a hippie and you were young, they weren't worried about you. We had 2 cops living in the house with us, as it turned out. We called them Salt and Pepper. They eventually did file some charges against Prasad. One for stealing the big picture of LBJ. They got him for grand theft, and then they got him for conspiracy to distribute marijuana because of the joint. But they didn't charge anyone else. It seemed like they were only interested in Prasad. And I think he beat those charges later. I don't recall him being too worried about him. Just a few times I met him, but I have to say that that group of Yippies had a big influence on me because they were not intimidated by the media or by the police or by the government. They wanted to resist, and they didn't worry about being marginalized. They had their own message, and they weren't really concerned if the mainstream America agreed with them, but they did want to get that message out there. They wanted to hook up with people who, were possible allies. And, they've really worked hard. If Dana and Aaron and all those, and Ben, all those people are still out there doing pretty much what they've done all along. And I'm sure a lot of those folks are here. I didn't see Ben around, but I know Aaron's here. So, you got to have respect for people who are committed enough and stick with an issue. We're talking 30 years. And so I was impressed, and I was also impressed by the way that we could always get in the newspaper and on television by doing these crazy actions. And I've been doing actions ever since, but they were the first group I ever did actions with. And A.J. Weberman was like the first person who really explained, how confrontation and real absurd behavior is more newsworthy than, all these press conferences and petition drives and all these other things that other people do. And he was also like a real inspiration to me in terms of his ability to scam things, how to get things for free and not pay your rent and get free airline tickets. And him and a fellow named Isaac Haber actually had worked mostly on Steal This Book, although since they couldn't get it published and Hoffman could basically write down anything and get it published at that point, Abbie Hoffman published Steal This Book, but most of the research on that book was done by people like Farsad and Isaac Haber and Dana Beale. In fact, they had convinced Hoffman to give them a bunch of copies of the book as a payment since they didn't get any of the advance. And I remember I had 2 copies. I had one copy that had Abbie Hoffman crossed out and it was signed by Isaac Haber, and I had another copy that was signed by Abbie Hoffman. And then I didn't hear about Tom until I'd heard that he started High Times. But at one point I was supposed to come out to the Bleecker Street, number 9 Bleecker Street? They just moved in there and they called me up. They knew I had some carpentry skills and, knew how to fix things, and it was a mess. And I was out in Southern Oregon living on a hippie commune, and they wanted me to come out to New York, so I started hitchhiking out to New York, but I'd run into a gal on the on-ramp in Cleveland and wound up staying in Cleveland instead, and I never actually made it out to Bleecker Street till like 1988, but they had been there that whole time, and I had lost contact with them by then, and Tom too. I mean, after the war ended, I was down in Florida. One of the women I'd met had gotten a small recreational sailboat. She had gotten a settlement from a car wreck she'd been in. She really didn't have enough money to buy a sailboat, and it wasn't a very expensive boat. And we were helping her getting it fixed up for sailing and all that stuff. And we did sailed out to the Dry Tortugas and then down to Key West. And then it was while we were in the Everglades that the last troops left southern Vietnam, and the only reason I knew about it, we just happened to be listening to the radio that night, and they started playing all these old Joan Baez and Bob Dylan songs, Country Joe, and it seemed like something must be up because people weren't listening to that music anymore. And then they broke in and said the last American troops have left. The war was basically over, and there hadn't been really a lot of organized opposition. I think that was 75. And the movement had pretty much dissipated, and there was a lot of backstabbing, and it was really kind of sour. And I was getting tired of it. I thought we had more things to do than to fight with the SDS and all these other groups, and that seemed to be all we were doing in those days. So I decided at that point that I was pretty much done with it, and that's when I hitchhiked out to Wyoming, because I was getting more involved in being outdoors, and I wanted to get into some of the bigger wilderness areas, and people kept telling me Wyoming was the place that you go. And I had run into a woman in the Everglades who was working in the tourist concession, and she just quit her job that day, so we got her on the sailboat. And then after we landed in Key West, I worked in a restaurant there for a little while just to get some money, and then she had a VW van, and we got in the van and we drove out to Boulder, Colorado, where her parents lived. And it was actually her dad. This is funny, her dad is Edward Lorenz, her name was Cheryl, but he's the inventor of the chaos theory. And it was about that time that he was coming up with chaos theory. And I was doing some hiking with him in the Rocky Mountains. He was a real avid mountain climber. And but every time we got on top of these mountains, I'd look out, I could see a strip mine or a ski area or a housing development, and it was bumming me out. And I was asking, well, is there any place in America where you can just climb up on a big mountain and not see nothing but wilderness? He says, well, unless you go to Alaska, that's the only place I know of is Wyoming. So Cheryl and I got in the van and drove up to Jackson Hole, and she left me a few months after that. She had to go back to school. And I stayed there for 8 years.